All right, part two, empirical thinking. So we've already talked about empirical thinking a little bit, but I'd like to really hammer it home because not only is it an incredibly important topic, but it's also one that can be a little bit difficult to explain. One of the activities you'll have is pretty much to just explain empirical thinking in your own words. And although we've gone through this material already, if you'd like some extra information, some more practice on it, uh, uh, feel free to go ahead and check this video. I really encourage you to look at it. It does a wonderful job of explaining empiricism and with a couple more examples and in a little bit of a different way than I've explained it so far. Let me give you some examples of empiricism from research that I'm familiar with. So a big part of empirical thinking, a big part of science is being skeptical. And in order to be skeptical, a lot of what scientists do is they'll go through and try and disprove their own theories. If you've ever read Sherlock Holmes, one of his most famous quotes is that once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. And so, along those same lines, scientists are always going to try and disprove theories to find which theory cannot be disproven and assume that that theory must be the best one. So here's an example. The cupboard theory was a theory of the connection between a mother and a child. So people used to think that what makes a baby love their mother is a little bit confusing, and there were a couple possible theories. One theory is that the mother provides food and provides milk to the baby, and so that's the cupboard theory, the idea that the mother is basically a cupboard for nutrition for whatever the baby needs. Another theory is that the mother provides a nurturing, caring, safe place. And so the way researchers actually checked this is they created an experiment where they put a baby monkey in a room with two fake mothers. And the mother on the left here, the one made out of wire and mesh, this mother actually has a bottle there. I don't know if you can quite see it, where the baby could drink milk out of. And the one on the right was made out of a cloth that was warmed and it had a mother-like face. And the idea was that the baby monkey would spend more time with whichever one of the two fake mothers it believed to be the real mother. And so the baby would spend some time drinking milk, but it spent most of its day hanging out with the warm, soft mother. And so what that tells us is that the nurturing, caring aspect of parenthood is actually what's more important out of a parent, not just the providing of food. And so I always I have a distaste for parents that don't really provide that warm comfort feeling. I feel like a lot of parents treat their children like plants. As long as they water them, that's good enough for them to grow, and that's really not the case. In order for you to be a good parent, you need to provide that safety and comfort and nurturing care. Another example for this comes from some funny sort of research where scientists were trying to understand just to conclude the previous. So by eliminating the food theory of what makes a parent, they were able to conclude that it must be that nurturing care. All right, so the ants example. Researchers were trying to figure out how do ants find their way to and from sources of food. And one scientist proposed that they're actually counting their steps. Now, that's kind of a weird proposal. There's no way ants are smart enough to count how many steps they take to get to their food. So what he did was he devised an interesting theory. Well, a hypothesis. If ants count their steps to get to their food, then if we make their steps weird, they will either overshoot or undershoot the location of their food. So we didn't want to cut the ants' legs off, but he did put ants on stilts. He attached little sticks to their legs so that their legs were longer. And what that meant is that each step was actually a little bit farther than what their normal steps were. And so when he did that, he actually found out that the ants were overstepping the length, the distance to their food. And when they counted the number of steps and the distance difference, they actually found out that the distance difference was the same as the amount that would be if they had counted their steps. So what that means is that this theory that the ants count their steps could not be disproven, and so it gained some efficacy, it gained some evidence under that empirical system. Let me give you one last example, just so that you can understand how this works in real life. Let's say that you don't know how a computer receives internet, how the computer hooks up to a Wi-Fi, and you wanted to find out. Now, if you couldn't ask anybody about this, what you might do is go through and just remove every piece of the computer, one by one. Take that piece out, see what happens with the computer, put it back, take a different piece out. And if you're taking each piece out individually, sometimes the computer won't turn on, sometimes the computer will maybe turn on but not really work, but at some point you'll turn it on and it just will work without internet. And there you go. You'll be able to identify that this is the part of the computer that receives Wi-Fi. And so that's another example of empirical thinking. Your evidence is that, well, it's not all of these other parts, and that when I did this part, it messed it up. Another major aspect of empirical thinking and science is the theory data cycle. And it looks complicated, but it's not too bad. So how do scientists explain the world around us? Well, you come up with a theory. I think that ants count their steps, and that's how they know how far to go. Then you have research questions. Well, if ants count their steps, does that mean that can we prove that ants actually do count their steps? Okay, so you create a design to identify that. Let's mess up the distance of their steps to see if that messes up their coordination. Okay, and we hypothesize that ants that have stilts on their legs will not arrive and instead will get too far away from the nest, and then gather data. The ants do get too far away from their nest. And so because this data supports our theory, because this data makes sense, it confirmed the hypothesis, it supports our theory, which leads our theory to have more evidence behind it. If, however, the ants with stilts still manage to get to the food, then we have non-supporting evidence, and we have to change our theory and come up with a new research design because clearly our theory was wrong. So we change our theory to a different theory and proceed through the whole system once again until we start getting lots of support for our theory. Like I said, science is all about being skeptical and checking yourself, and this is kind of the process by which we do that. All right, last thing in this section, there are a couple points I want to make just to hammer home the ideas of empirical thinking. First of all, good scientific theories have evidence to them. We've talked about that. Good scientific theories are falsifiable. That just means that you can prove a theory right or wrong. So when we're doing science, your theory has to be something you can check on, like ants count their steps. If you have a theory that says ants find their way to their food via magic, there's no real way to check whether magic is actually happening, so we can't really classify that as a scientific theory. Now, this is where, if you have questions about faith, things come into play. Faith and science are two completely different things, and they really do not rule each other out. If you have a belief system that cannot be proven, that doesn't mean it's true or false. It just means that you're not working with science, you're working with faith. Next up, scientific theories must be repeatable. So if you do the same experiment, you get the same results. Scientific theories have parsimony. This is the idea of Occam's razor, or that your theories should be simple. The idea is that the way things work should always be elegant. If you have to come up with a bunch of different exclusions or situations where your theory doesn't really work out very well, you may need to come up with a better theory. For example, if you have the theory ants count their steps and you find out that the stilts system breaks your theory and the ants still manage to get to their food with the stilts, you should change your theory instead of coming up with a complicated theory like ants count their steps except when they're wearing stilts. Because that's a more complicated theory, it really wouldn't really work with this parsimony idea. So the idea of parsimony is to try and keep your theories simple and elegant. Finally, it's difficult to prove things are perfectly true. So you may have heard that the theory of gravity is just a theory, and therefore we can't believe that it's totally true. Um, the thing about that is that the theory of gravity is quite complicated. It actually involves quite a bit of mathematics associated with how gravity works. Do we know that gravity exists? Yes, if you jump, you're gonna come back down to Earth. But are we sure about how we think it exists? Well, we have formulas and we have a lot of evidence, but good scientists are always skeptical. So we're never going to say that we're 100% totally sure about stuff. Instead, we're going to say that we have a lot of evidence for those things, which is why we avoid saying we have proved anything. There's a lot more we could talk about here in learning what is empirical science, and I've got some more examples here, but I think this is enough for now. Let's go through them. It'll take just a couple seconds. I'll go through them quickly though. First, Russell's teapot. The idea of Russell's teapot is that there's no way for someone to totally disprove something, only to prove something. It's not possible to provide evidence. It's a lot harder to provide evidence against something than it is to provide evidence in favor of something. Let me provide this example. So let's say that I propose there is a teapot floating around the Earth. Now, if I ask you to prove me wrong, I am committing a mistake because you don't need to prove me wrong. There is no reason for anyone to believe that there's a teapot floating around the Earth. So instead, people should focus on providing evidence for that teapot and attempting to disprove that evidence. Does that make any sort of sense? It's a complicated sort of idea, and I really would encourage you, if you are interested in that idea, to go ahead, just go to YouTube, type in Russell's teapot, and see if you can find out more examples. Now, another example of this is the Ouija board example. It's the idea that you want to try and always rule out possible explanations. So the way, if you've ever dealt with a Ouija board, the way it works is it's supposed to be a way for you to talk to spirits. So you have a board, it's got a bunch of letters and yes and no on it, and you and a couple of friends put your hands on it and you ask questions of the spirits. And supposedly, the little looking glass that you have will move over to the letters and spell things out as a response. Now, those responses could be from a ghost, but they also could be from your friends or yourself moving the little selector piece on your own. And so, in order to identify is somebody moving the selector piece, what you could do is go through and do the Ouija board with everyone minus one person, and try every single person until you find out who's moving the piece. Or maybe try the Ouija board without the touching the piece and see if it moves on its own. So, there's a lot of different examples we can have for empirical thinking, but the long and short of it is that you want to focus on evidence-based thought, and that's all that science is about. There should be a couple activities following this video that'll help you practice the idea of empirical thinking and hopefully make it make a little bit more sense. In the next video, we'll learn about what are the nuts and bolts of research, different types of research practices, and hopefully you'll get a bit of a better idea of what research actually looks like in addition to being scientifically sound.